Welcome to another health discussion on Wellspring Wellness Forum. We're glad you've chosen to pause a while to join us on a very personal topic, that of mental health and trauma. May is National Trauma Month and Mental Awareness Month. The past few years, we've seen an increase in mental health and trauma related challenges as the world has tried to adjust to a great number of traumatic events, including losses brought on by the pandemic. The World Health Organization conceptualizes mental health as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. The American Psychological Association adds that mental health is a state of mind characterized by emotional well-being, good behavioral adjustment, relative freedom from anxiety and disabling symptoms, and a capacity to establish constructive relationships and cope with the ordinary demands and stresses of life. Both organizations' views of mental health emphasize the ability to cope and meet ordinary demands and stresses of life. Mental health is serious and extremely impacting. We usually don't give much thought to mental health issues until we find ourselves struggling to manage our lives, or we hear about somebody else's problems, one who is having a hard time doing the same thing. The entertainment world was recently rocked at the news of a well-known acclaimed music icon succumbing to a mental health condition. Now, here is somebody who seemed to have achieved what most people only dream about, and in her darkest hour felt so much pain that she determined her only option was to take her life. The Center for Disease Control suggests that 11.3% of adults aged 18 and above experience regular feelings of worry, nervousness, or anxiety. We're talking about large numbers here, folks. 55.7 million people visit physician offices yearly with mental disorders as a primary diagnosis. And about 4.9 million people visit emergency rooms with mental disorders, behavioral and neurodevelopmental challenges as a primary diagnosis. In 2020, there were about 45,799 recorded suicides, up from 42.773 in 2014. And this is according to the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics. Now, worldwide, we're talking about an estimated 1 million people who die by suicide every year. Globally, suicide ranks among the 3 leading causes of death among those aged 15 and 44. Attempted suicides are up to 20 times more frequent than completed ones. Mental health is a costly challenge. Have you had trauma in your life or know someone who is having a hard time following a traumatic event? Are you experiencing symptoms of trauma exposure? Are you wanting answers to your concerns for yourself or for someone else and hope to find healing? Well, you're in the right place. Sit back and join us. We have a panel of experts who will do their best to help answer your questions. Now, let me introduce to you our panelists. We're going to start with Dr. Stacy Nicely. Dr. Nicely serves as Clinical Assistant Professor of Psychology in the Graduate Department of Psychology and Counseling. She's also an adjunct faculty in the School of Distance Education, and she's a staff psychologist at the Counseling and Testing Center here at Andrews University. She's a colleague of mine. I'm glad to have you here this afternoon. Dr. Nicely, prior to pursuing a career in psychology, worked in commercial banking for 10 years. She provides individual, couples, premarital and marital therapy, and group therapy as well. And she treats depression, anxiety, stress, trauma-related concerns, and provides therapeutic interventions for matters related to resilience, self-esteem, personal growth, interpersonal relationship concerns, among others. She is also a certified trauma therapist. Welcome, Dr. Nicely. Our next panelist is Dr. David Sedlacek, and he's a regular on our program. Dr. Sedlacek is professor of family ministry and discipleship at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University and chair of the Department of Discipleship in Lifespan Education. He received his master's and doctorate in social work from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. He has worked in various settings from both public and private, as a clinician, researcher, teacher, pastor, chaplain, and administrator. He has worked extensively in the areas of addiction, abuse, relationships, marriage, and family. He is a certified family life educator and a licensed clinical social worker. Now, together with his wife, Beverly, Dr. Sedlacek has written a book. It's entitled Cleansing the Sanctuary of the Heart, Tools for Emotional Healing. And he's done this along with an accompanying workbook. Welcome, Dr. Sedlacek. We're so glad to have you here with us today. And our third panelist, who will be our main presenter this today, is Professor Ingrid Slickers. Professor Slickers is a licensed clinical and macro social worker. She joined the Andrews Social Work Department in 2016, having practiced social work since the early 1990s. She comes from an Argentinian pastoral family, having lived in various places, including overseas. Now, early in her career, she worked at a homeless shelter, juvenile detention center, specialized summer camps, and at a psychiatric hospital for children. After receiving her graduate degree, Professor Slickers worked as a child and family therapist for many years, focusing on the treatment of trauma, loss, and family issues. She's a certified clinical trauma professional and part of the International Association of Trauma Professionals. She's also a truth-based relational intervention practitioner. Professor Slickers is married, has 2 young adult sons, and your daughter-in-law, and enjoys reading and traveling, having been involved in children and family church ministries and education. She is daily in awe, she says, of the intersection of faith and science and the hope of healing that this brings. Professor Slickers will start off our discussion with a presentation on the topic, after which the other panelists will join us, and they will join in to further discuss the topic and answer questions that you may have. Welcome, Professor Slickers. In a few minutes, we'll start hearing from you. Now, I want to let you know, everybody who's viewing this, that you may write questions as you're listening to our panelists talk. Please write those in the chat, and we're going to do our best to answer as many of the questions as you can. So after Professor Slickers does the presentation, we will have the other panelists join us. They will answer as many questions as we can. So without further delay, let's listen to Professor Ingrid Slickers.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and for joining us today. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. As you all well know, we have become not the experts, but the commonality of using these PowerPoints in this medium when COVID hit. And so we're grateful because we can come together like this across miles and be able to share information, which a few years back we probably would not have thought about doing. So again, thank you, Dr. Fisher, for having me on today. And Let's do a little bit of talking. So, the title today was How to Survive and Thrive Beyond Trauma. As you see here, Dr. Fisher explained that all of us work at Andrews University. Andrews, in the fall of 2019, started our International Center for Trauma Education and Care, knowing the importance of educating really our worldwide community on the impact of trauma and the hope and healing that can happen in communities. So we're going to talk about that in our few minutes together. I always start this presentation with a trigger alert. I know that's kind of maybe it's a millennial word. It isn't a word that we've used for a very long time, but it's a trigger alert because we're going to be talking about hard things. And when we talk, potentially it may bring up something within you or a concern about somebody that you love and you care about. And so I want to give you that trigger alert in case there's something we discuss. Please reach out to your support system if you find it difficult to listen or when we're done. We will have numbers at the end, but also know that hang on with us because we're going to talk about how there is restoration. So even though at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to talk about how deep and serious the problem is, our goal is to bring hope and healing as well, by the grace of God. So let's do some talking about definitions. Now, again, there's various definitions as to what trauma is. I put some on here on the screen if you're looking, but I want to draw your attention to a few things, right? So one is that trauma is something outside of the normal range of daily human experience. So there is hard things that happen in our lives. But some things are beyond that. Bessel van der Kolk, well-known author from The Body Keeps the Score, which is a highly recommended book if you want to do some more reading on trauma, talks about trauma being something that overwhelmed our central nervous system. So now we're talking about our body and how that's involved with an event that might happen to us or has happened to us. You see there too that toward the bottom of the screen that it says, when you go through, see, or learn about an event involving actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. And the reason we always include, when we present through the Trauma Ed Center, we always include this definition is because there are many things that happen to us. But sometimes we forget that our kids are impacted by things they hear. And nowadays we've got constant bombardment of actual threatened death, serious injury. I think about almost 3 summers ago with the death of George Floyd, how we were able to watch it happen. And so let's not forget that even those things are impacting our brains. Another definition that often we use is this: psychological or emotional trauma is damage or injury to the mind after living through an extremely frightening, distressing event. It may result in challenges in functioning or coping normally after the event. So it's important to see that if we're having challenges and struggles after the event, that may be an indication that it impacted us in a way that we didn't realize. A final definition that we like to use is just to recognize that the word trauma comes from the Greek word for wound. It's evolved over the years, right, to mean both physical trauma and emotional wounds. And today, for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to be talking about emotional psychological trauma and its relationship to mental health. But we must have another perspective. And so many times for those of us that work in the trauma field, we talk about the big T's and the little t traumas. And here's why I want to bring our attention to it, because nobody can deny that war is traumatic, right? What's going on in Ukraine, what's been happening in Ethiopia, what's been happening in Myanmar. Nobody can deny that war is traumatic or that sexual abuse is traumatic, or that crime is traumatic. You see those big T traumas. But many times we fail to recognize the little T traumas, the emotional abuse, the neglect, losses, bullying, failed experiences, abrupt moves, repeated criticism, and even spiritual trauma. And again, we only listed a few of them. And we must recognize and understand that these affect us too. Now, are there various kinds of trauma? Yes. And I promise we're kind of cruising through this information rather quickly. But we could spend a lot of time on each of these. But I just want to bring them up because you may hear these different people talk about different ways. Acute trauma. So acute trauma would be one single incident, one single car accident, for example. Chronic trauma would be repeated and prolonged. So sadly, this could be something like sexual abuse. It's repeated and prolonged. Complex trauma now is varied in multiple traumatic events. So sadly, maybe for that individual, they actually struggled from sexual abuse and then they had a car accident. So now we've got complex. And then vicarious trauma is the response to an accumulation of exposure to the pain of others. And this is something that we talk about a lot at Andrews as we're training our students to go out into the field. But I think it goes for all of us because our world is under so much torment, so much devastation. And because we as Christians are answering the call to help and to serve each other, we are hearing and being exposed to an accumulation of a lot of pain from others. And so we do need to be aware of how that might impact us. So what's going on? Let's talk a little bit about the brain. And again, that is not my area of expertise. I am not a biologist. But in our trauma field, we do need to talk about our brain responses. Triune brain. So often we talk about the triune brain having the brain stem, right? So what sometimes we call the lizard brain. This is the first part of the brain that grew, right? In utero, when you see that baby through our amazing technology that we can now see, that little lima bean baby, right? We see that brain stem growing, that part of the brain starts to grow first. So that's our survival brain. Then slowly the limbic system grows. This is the mammalian brain, the mammal brain, where there's emotions, there's memories, there's habits. And then finally, we've got our cerebral cortex. So right here, our thinking brain, just to simplify it a little bit, this is where abstract thought, language, imagination, etc. We have an amazing brain that God created. Amazing. But what can happen? Let's talk about that. God gave us an amazing ability to respond to stress. Our bodies respond. So something happens. There's alarm, resistance, and then there's exhaustion. So something happens, but then you come down. So what happens in the body? The amygdala reaches out to the hippocampus. Cortisol is released. We have a stress response. And many of you have heard about our stress responses, right? We talk a lot about fight, flight, freeze. There's two more that have been added in the field that we talk some about. Fawn. So fawn is literally, think of a baby deer. Fawn has to do with submitting. So maybe you're not seeing the fight, flight, or total freeze, but you're submitting. Fawn response. Flock response, we see a lot with refugees where we flock together. We've seen it in school shootings where we flock together for safety as our stress response. Again, what an amazing God we serve, that our body works together. But let's talk about that for a minute. So here we are. And if you're watching us live, it's a sunny afternoon here in Michigan. I don't know about where you are. And if you're watching us later, I don't know what time of day it is. But imagine yourself, it's a beautiful Sabbath afternoon, and we decide we're going to go for a nature hike. So yes, I titled this story time. So use your imagination. Here we are in these beautiful woods. We're going to go for a walk and enjoy nature. And as we're walking along, we kind of hear a stick kind of break, and we kind of pause and wonder what that was. And we continue on and we hear another stick, another little noise. We start to feel in our bodies maybe, I'm hearing too many noises that don't sound like the woods. We realize that the birds have stopped singing. Maybe it's a little bit eerily quiet, but with these sticks breaking. And all of a sudden, look at what's in front of us. So what do you think our response is going to be? We're going to pick one of those stress responses, right? Now, hopefully you're not going to fight the bear in this situation, but maybe some of us would. But you get what I'm talking about. The stress response comes. If I'm with someone, I may grab onto them to flock. Hopefully we won't submit. I don't know exactly what we'd do. Maybe we'd freeze initially. Maybe we'd flee. We'd use the flight response. And then once we got to safety, we'd say, can you believe what just happened? So let's talk about what happened to our bodies. Maybe even as I was telling you the story, you're imagining it, you would feel that stress in your body, all those hormones, all those chemicals being released. But then once we were in safety, all of that would come down. So that's that exhaustion piece, right? All of that would come down. Now tell me, do you think right then when suddenly we realized it was that grizzly and that grizzly was getting ready to attack us, do you think our prefrontal cortex was online and it was saying, I think this time of year, a grizzly isn't going to attack, or I think they're mating, or what are the eating habits of grizzlies? No. That logical thought never made it because we are in that automatic stress response, which is the survival response. Later, maybe, we would be thinking about it. But what if this grizzly lives in your home? What if this grizzly lives in your neighborhood? What if this grizzly is in your church? And you're always in that survival stress response. This leads us to just briefly touch on the ACEs. I know Dr. Sedlacek is going to talk to us a little bit more about that later today. The ACE study, if you are not familiar with it, I'll let you do some Google searches. You'll find plenty of information that the ACE study, which it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, is a study that was done by the CDC, basically to look at American health, heart disease, diabetes, other things, realizing that the things that happen to us when we're children impact our health in significant ways. And we call this toxic stress. So again, think about that grizzly. So think about in children having these situations where we've got this toxic stress and left unaddressed can affect us in significant ways. Now you see on this slide, and again, I'm cruising through it really quickly. There's 3 realms of ACE. So one would be household ACEs. So look at that, right? We're looking at, was there domestic violence? Was there maternal depression? Was there homelessness? And sometimes as Christians or Seventh-day Adventists or other religious denominations, we pause and we say, well, these must be things that happen outside of us. But no, if you look at that, there's parental mental illness, there's divorce, emotional abuse. These things affect us. And they're within our churches, our communities, they're everywhere. The second area there is you see community, historical trauma, discrimination, poor housing, poor water and air quality. That affects us. And then number 3 is our environment, natural disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes. Pandemic. That has impacted us. And what happens with the ACE, before I go on to the cat hair, I'm going to go back to that, is when we look at the ACE study, there's various checklists and there's numbers that you come up with. So, you may have an ACE score of 1 or an ACE score of 2 or an ACE score of 3. The general ACE scale, there have been some that have been expanded, is 10. We have seen if you have an ACE of 4 out of 10, so not we, but researchers, you have a 460% more chance of being depressed in your adulthood. Okay, so it's an ACE score of 4. You are 1,220%, so basically 1,200% more likely to attempt suicide. And so when trauma affects us, especially during those early years, its impact is significant even into adulthood. Let's talk a little bit about cat hair. So Panksepp did some research with rats. And he had some rats in a cage. These were young rats. And playing. He was just watching them play. Normal kind of baby rats. And he introduced into the cage 1 cat hair. Now, it's important for us to note that these rats had never been exposed to a cat before. Okay? He exposed 1 cat hair. And these rats stopped playing completely. He left the cat hair in there for 24 hours, but it caused such fear in these rats, they stopped playing completely. He removed the cat hair after 24 hours and waited to see what would happen. It took a little bit, and those rats started to play, but just a little bit. So the residual effects, mind you, of generational trauma is with us as well. Again, these rats had never seen a cat. So something in their history had caused them to be scared of this cat. And we call this epigenetics. We know there's been research into, sadly, how the experiences of our previous generations can affect who we are. Intergenerational trauma, community trauma. The Bible tells us that, up to the sins into the 2nd and 3rd generation. If it wasn't enough already with everything happening about and around us. So how does trauma, toxic stress affect the brain? Well, as many of you know, for a long time we didn't have words for it. After the World Wars, we called it shell shock, because we would see soldiers come back from war with no external wounds, but yet we knew something was going on. And it wasn't until we started being able to do brain imaging that we knew that it biologically impacted our brain. So why is this? And you see there on the slide of the brain scans, the brain on the left is a healthy, functioning brain. The brain on the right is actually a brain of a little kiddo that was neglected. Now, mind you, not neglected from food and water or nutrition, but neglected emotionally. And so black means least activity in the brain. Red is most activity in the brain. And so you could see that how these 2 kids in school would be doing so much differently. How their cause and effect thinking, their decision levels making would be different. And so we know that trauma affects our brain biologically. I remember in the field, being in the field for 30 years now, when we started talking about these brain images and this feeling of now what? Because we can't go back to childhood. We can't go back to things that have happened to us. What can we do? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. There's hope and healing, and that's what's so amazing, where we can see activity in that brain again. In those blackened areas, we can see activity. And why is this happening? Because basically the brain is flooded with cortisol. And again, there isn't enough time to get into all of it. But when the brain is under so much stress, so think that grizzly bear example, if you're always in that elevated toxic stress level, it's like your brain is flooded with cortisol. There's a picture there of cars being flooded. Do we need rain? Yes. But too much rain can cause problems. And that's where our concern is, that if our cortisol levels remain high for too long, it can actually lead to depression, decreased prefrontal cortex functioning. So how deep is the mud? It depends on who you ask. So sometimes when I do these presentations, people say, but Ingrid, I experience this or I experience that and I'm okay. But my sibling went through the same thing, but yet they're not functioning so well. So what's the difference? The difference too sometimes is what we are born with. We are born with certain just resiliency factors. So look at these two dogs, right? For that big dog, he's like, dude, to the little dog who's drowning in the mud. The big dog is like, dude, what's the big deal? Right? Depends on who you ask. We all respond differently. And think about that brain scans you just saw. We don't know what's going on or what has happened to someone. Ooh, we have been going for about 30 minutes, according to my clock. And something that we like to do as students is what we call a brain break, because we can only focus for so long. So because we're talking about brain health and brain and mind ability to think clearly and make wise decisions, I need to give you a brain break. So here's what a brain break looks like. We want to reconnect the left and the right hemispheres to talk to each other. So quite often we do these funny things, such as touch your nose, grab your ear, and do it again. This helps us to kind of get both sides of the brain back. Sometimes we do what we call cross-lateral tapping, just to get both sides of the body active again. So take a moment, maybe do that so you can refocus, because now we need to talk solutions. When you hear all the things that we just talked about, it's devastating. And hopefully you're understanding how widespread trauma is, how it impacts in many ways every single one of us in different ways. If not us personally, then somebody very close to us. So we want to talk about resilience. Now, resilience seems to be this big word that everybody's using. Sometimes we call it strengths. Sometimes we call it protective factors. But really, resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, right? And it lists family, relationships, serious health problems, workplace, and financial stressors. We all want to be resilient. God wants us to be resilient. So what are things we can do? Well, that's what we're going to talk about now. You ready? First and foremost, prayer is powerful, powerful, powerful. So above all else, we pray. We pray for healing. We pray for wisdom. We pray to understand each other. We pray for solutions. We pray for the ability to be strong and seek help. Prayer is powerful. But we can't stop there. It's prayer and what else can we do? First, prayer, yes. What else can we do? Well, our amazing brain, right? We've been talking about the amazing brain. We need to remember that the brain is also an organ. So we need to talk about brain health. We're talking about mental health and our mind, but the brain is an organ. It's a physical organ. You can see it there. So what are things we can do? We just talked about all these things that are outside of our control, all those domains of the ACEs. What can we do? Sleep. Our brain needs sleep so we can think clearly. Nutrition. We all know that. right? We know these things. You're probably like, Ingrid, we know this stuff. We do, but are we doing it? There's so many things out of our control. This is something we can do. Sunshine, vitamin D. So again, we live in Michigan. We don't get a lot of sunshine. So we talk a lot about the importance of vitamin D and getting out in the sun. So some of the latest research they're saying, especially for children, is to encourage them to go outside and make sure their forearms are showing so that the vitamin D absorption actually needs to be in your forearms. So go outside and pull up your sleeves. Let the sun be on your forearms. It's something we can do. Vitamin D, make sure you're talking to your medical provider if you feel like you are struggling with some depression or some anxiety that maybe you didn't feel before. We're seeing that our food, even if it's organic and healthy food, is just not having enough vitamin D. And we're seeing significant depression and anxiety, especially in our adolescents and young adults, that have to do with low levels of vitamin D. Now, a regular blood work may not show that. It has to be a specific blood work, but a doctor can easily order that to check the levels of vitamin D for you, for your loved ones, because then you just add a supplement. It's very much something that we need to look at. Like I said, especially for our young people. Exercise. Wow. We know we release all those positive endorphins, those things that help us to regulate, help us to come down, reduce that cortisol we were just talking about. Water. Your brain needs water. It needs water to think clearly. It needs water to flush everything out. So again, it's something we can do. And people say, Ingrid, I just can't keep up with how many ounces am I supposed to drink? It's my age divided by, well, I work a lot with children. And so we're just pretty clear about it. We just say, if your urine is clear, then you're good. So keep an eye out for that. It's something you can do. Water. Nature. Oh, so much research into the impact of nature and how that literally heals our brain. We can see activity in those areas. There's so much science behind that. And then professional support. This is so important. We just mentioned making sure you're checking with your medical provider, right? Making sure that you're letting them know how you're feeling. Professional support may also mean counseling and therapy. I've had people just say, but Ingrid, do we really need to go to therapists or really need to go to counselors? And what about medication, like medication for anxiety or depression? What about that? Does that mean I'm not having enough faith? I just need to think more clearly. Well, we just talked about the brain being an organ. And so sometimes I talk about, let's say you start having a tickle in your throat and you're not feeling real good. And so the first things you do are, well, let me do some natural things, right? We're gonna drink our water and our teas, and we're gonna sleep, and we're gonna do our vitamin C and our orange juice and all of that stuff. But that tickle starts to get a little bit worse. So maybe we actually do get some cold medicine, but pretty soon we realize we're really coughing and it might be in our lungs. We need to seek some professional support. And so we go to the doctor. Same thing goes for mental health. We go talk to a professional and a doctor potentially, because the doctor may actually recommend some medication. We might need an antibiotic for our lungs if we're coughing. So we talk to our doctors, we talk to our counselors. That's why God gave us science and the ability to now have all these professionals we can talk to. Check your insurance. A lot of insurances and employers, you actually have sometimes up to 10 or 12 free counseling sessions. Take them. How amazing is that to get some consultation in? Many of you may even have pastors that you feel like I could go talk to if they've been trained. And none of those would cost any money, because sometimes people are worried about the financial. But check your communities, because even here at Andrews, we have free services for our community. So check what's available for you. Professional support. It's something you can do. Our human nervous system is amazing. We just talked about that stress response, right? So That stress response is that crisis response. That really is our sympathetic nervous system. God made us in this amazing way that basically everything else shuts down so we can survive, right? Grizzly bear, does your body need to be digesting right then? No. It needs to be helping to keep you safe and to survive. But at some point, you need to move into that parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest digest system or the rest restore system. And that's where, again, maybe there's some things we can intentionally do to make sure we're moving into that rest digest system. Many people say, I have so many digestive issues. Could it be anxiety? Could it be nerves, staying in our sympathetic nervous system too long that we're not able to get over to that rest restore system? So what do? We talk a lot about trauma-informed care. Here's your 3 pillars, and we're going to cruise through these really fast. How do we care for each other? We want safe environments. We want to support and teach emotional regulation where we're understanding what's happening. And we're going to build relationships and connectedness. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to teach you a couple of techniques, and what you'll see the little star there, it says tool. So at our Trauma Ed Center, we do work a lot with teachers and other educators. And some of the things I threw into this PowerPoint have to do with kids. And the reason I threw it in there is because if you're watching this, chances are there's a kid in your life. Maybe you can help teach some of these things to them. But I've also found that these kid tools, they're a great thing for us. So this comes from Dan Siegel's work, and he talks about flipping your lid. So again, we think about that, this being our brain stem, this being our limbic system. This is our brain and our response system. When we're getting really activated with a crisis response, this part of the brain's got to really stay active to help us survive. Well, what can happen is our frontal cortex goes offline because everything has to survive, right? So it's that grizzly bear. But we need to find ways to lessen this load, right? This is all that cortisol stuff, so that prefrontal cortex can come back and we can make good decisions. And so what are some things we can do to calm this part of the brain? And a lot of times when I work with families and kids, I teach them this because it could be that a kid's coming home from school and maybe they got bullied and maybe something happened on the bus and maybe there's already some pre-existing things that are going on, and that kiddo gets off the bus and they're already kind of like this. And then suddenly here comes mom. Maybe mom and dad have been fighting. Maybe there's some stuff going on and mom's like this. And all of a sudden, if we're both like this, where do you think the communication's going to be at? So first and foremost, we have to find ways to lower that lid. So what are some things we can do? Again, we can educate. Here's another quick tool. We call this the barking dog. Barking dog is there to say, danger, danger, danger. We need our barking dogs, guard dogs. But when the barking dog is going off, our wise owl cannot sit there and help us make good decisions. And so even when I work with kids, I'll say, where's your barking dog at? What can we do to calm that dog down? Here's one of the ways we can calm that dog down. Move ourselves into that parasympathetic rest restore system. Breathing. And many of you have heard the science behind it. And some people think, well, it can't be that legit. It is. And it's our first gift from God. When God created Adam, the first gift was that breath of life. And that breath of life keeps us going. Now, we don't have time to talk about all the different tips and tricks of different ways of breathing. You can do a quick Google search. But remember, it's a gift from God. And breathing, intentional breathing, can move us into that parasympathetic nervous system. It can help us bring our lid down. It can help our wise owl to return and calm the dog down. Are we breathing intentionally? Are we teaching those around us and our children? Here's another quick tool, the vagus nerve. And I'm sorry that I'm cruising through these really fast. The vagus nerve is getting a lot of attention right now. That is the longest cranial nerve. So it starts, and it comes from our brain. It wanders. It's a wandering nerve all the way down to our pelvic floor. It is the nerve that's responsible for moving us from our sympathetic nervous system, the crisis, into our parasympathetic nervous system, rest, restore, rest, digest. And here's some things they're finding. If you sing, you can activate that nervous system. If you hum loudly, you can actually feel yourself vibrating that. And I've had people say, my grandma always hummed songs and hymns, and she went through such a hard time in her life. That may have been one of the ways she was regulating her nervous system. We also know singing together helps connect with others. So sing loudly. I think about Peter and Silas when they were in jail. Do you remember? They didn't know what was going to happen the next morning. Remember? They had been stripped. They had been beaten. They had been thrown in. Their hands and their feet were in stocks. And they sang. They sang. Can we sing? And some of the beauty in activating that vagus nerve is that your out breath, your exhalation needs to be longer than your inhalation. But again, you can do a quick Google search to find some more about that. Oh, magic mustache. This is a fun one we do with kids. We teach kids, there's a good pressure point right here. And you see many of us will, when we're thinking deeply, will kind of pause like this. So again, if you're starting to feel yourself getting a little bit activated, that fight, flight, freeze response, because of past trauma, maybe right now as I'm talking, you're feeling your body react a certain way, just slight pressure right here will actually help. Things we can do. Safe touch. The more the merrier for hugs. We know it strengthens the immune system. God made us in community. God made us for touch. 4 hugs a day for survival. This is Virginia Satir. She's a family therapist. 8 hugs a day for maintenance, 12 hugs a day for growth. COVID really affected this. I remember many churches, where the pastor gets up and says, everybody greet each other, brother and sisterly love, and you get your 12 hugs that day. When COVID happened, we saw that wasn't happening. And so are you getting those hugs? Can you ask for safe touch? Can you give safe touch? The role of religion. The role of religion is a risk and protective factor. Now you might say, well, what do you mean, Ingrid? It's a risk factor. Well, sadly, sometimes there's shame where we want to hide and we just put our church face on. And so there's risk factors because we hide and we feel shameful that we're struggling with any of the things we just talked about. But we also know that religion can be a protective factor because we have community, we have faith. We should have unconditional regard and unconditional love. It should be the utmost safe environment. That's God's plan for us. And we are his church, not the building. When trauma-informed care, when the research came out, there was a psychiatrist by the name of Sandra Bloom who created a model of care, secular model of care called the Sanctuary Model. It has nothing to do with our Old Testament sanctuary model. But her concept, and she was the originator of this, is instead of asking what's wrong with you, we're going to ask, what has happened to you? So we're not going to look at each other and wonder what's wrong with him. Why are they using substances? Why are they drinking? Well, maybe their ACE score is really, really high. But it leads us to think about, I remember when I went to get trained about our biblical sanctuary model and how God said, I will restore you. And he came to be in the middle of us. He didn't go on the outside of camp. He came to the middle and he said, God's the one who says, not what's wrong with you, what's happened to you. And can we do that with each other? We know gratitude helps heal our brains, helps to connect more neurodynamic, active brain. Science tells us, secular science. And some of our secular research says that you need to be thankful for at least 3 things a day. I find it fascinating that Daniel in the Bible used to pray 3 times a day. But if you open your text and you look, it said Daniel went before the Lord with thanksgiving 3 times a day. Can we do that so that we can stimulate those areas of our brain and go into that parasympathetic nervous system? So I'm going to wrap up real quick with a scientific experiment that was done again sadly with animals. We talked about rats, but this was done with monkeys years ago. And they put a monkey in a cage and they tried to traumatize the monkey. So they rattled it and did loud noise and just everything they could so this monkey could be traumatized. And prior to the experiment, they checked, blood pressure levels, cortisol levels, all those levels. And at the end of the experiment, they checked those levels again. And as you can well imagine, it had extremely elevated cortisol levels, all these physical responses. So then they duplicated the experiment, took a fresh monkey, but this time they put 2 monkeys together in a cage and did the same thing. This time, at the end, the monkey's cortisol levels, all those elevated levels, were reduced by 50%, simply because he was not alone. Can we be that for each other? These are 2 greats in our field. Bessel van der Kolk says being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental. Doesn't God tell us that? It's all about relationships. And Bruce Perry says relationships matter. We love that last line. People, not programs, change people. Can we be each other's people? So here at the Trauma Ed Center, we cling to this verse. We talked about some devastating things today, but we say we believe in a God of hope that can fill us with joy and peace as we trust so that we can overflow into those around us. And that's my prayer for you today.
Professor Slickers, this is just amazing. There is so much that you've covered over the past few minutes, and a couple of things just stuck with me. One of those is the fact that we may not be able to pretty much protect ourselves from a lot of things that are happening in our lives, but we can certainly do something to keep ourselves in a good space, even beyond the trauma. We're talking about activating, for example, the vagus nerve. And it was interesting to hear you talk about being able to sing. And singing does that, it helps. And somebody made that comment right there as well. In addition to hugging one another and providing a lot of support. And so there is hope, regardless of how difficult life has been, regardless of how traumatized one may have been. There's always hope. And it's good to hear that, because that is something we want to focus on. I want to bring the other panelists on at this time. We have about maybe 30 minutes to talk a little bit more about this very important topic. And I won't take any more of your time. Dr. Nicely, what are a couple of thoughts that really stuck with you from the presentation? And then right after that, we'll go on to Dr. Sedlacek.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. I really liked Ingrid's presentation, particularly the part about the strategies. And I feel like it's a little unfair to pick things up because all of it was so good, so informative. Thank you, Ingrid. The part that you focused on the big T versus the little t, and I know that has been a point of controversy among some individuals, especially during the recent pandemic, because people are now beginning to question, well, is this really trauma? How do we make the differentiation between what is considered trauma or not? So I like that you mentioned on the big T versus the little t's. And then just some strategies. The vagus nerve is an important part of providing individuals who've experienced trauma with ways that trauma gets stuck in the body and how we can release the trauma. As you talked about the vagus nerve, some other techniques came to mind in terms of how we can stimulate the vagus nerve. And it is believed that the vagus nerve is more accessible through the neck and the ear. And so another strategy that we can use to stimulate the vagus nerve is inserting a finger in the space just above the ear canal and gently massaging that area. And as you do that, you find that your breathing begins to change just a little. Just gently massaging. Another strategy is tilting the chin up and to the left and feeling that tension in the neck. And as you do that, you also feel your breathing begin to change, and you can switch sides. So chin up and tilted to the right. And you hold there for a couple of seconds. And so once you do that, you begin to feel that your body begins to relax. And those are just some other basic strategies that we can add to the toolbox of stimulating the vagus nerve to release trauma from the body.
Wonderful. This is good news. This is also a reminder that we have control. We have some control. Even though at an early age we may have experienced sexual abuse, we may have experienced physical abuse, we may have experienced traumatic events, it's not all lost. These things are some things that we can do now in the present moment to help us to regain control, to recover from, and to experience healing. Thank you, Dr. Knisely. Dr. Sedlacek, tell us a little bit, add a little bit more to it, please.
Thank you. I surely will. And I'm going to real quickly share and go through we've been doing studies of seminary students, future pastors, and their adverse childhood experiences. And I want to quickly tell you, and this is so important for us to understand. Here we're comparing students from 2020 and 2021, seminary students, with the national average. Emotional abuse, look at this, 40%, 28%, national average 33%, so somewhere close. But look at this physical abuse, 28%, 20%, national average is only 17. Look at sexual abuse, 26%, 13%, national average is 11. Look at this, parents separated or divorced, almost 40%, 30.8%, but national average only 28%. What is that telling us about our seminary students? Domestic violence, first year 24.2%, second year 10%, national average 17.76. Parental drug addiction, it's less because we don't tend to drink or use drugs than the national average. But look at this one, parental mental illness, 29.5%, 23.1% compared to the national average of 16.16%. Family member in prison, again, about the same as national average. But we also are looking at some other adverse childhood experiences too, where children feel over-controlled, okay, or spiritual abuse, students feeling beaten up by the Bible or the writings of Ellen White, or being told you're a poor Christian if you don't do certain things. Being bullied, look at this, over about a third. Or coerced to perform in order to earn approval, over a third of our students. Those are subtle forms of abuse. Now, the last slide I want to share is this one, comparing male and female ACEs, okay? Those who have experienced, this is general population now, who experience none, okay, about 36%, men a little more than women. One ACE, 26%, Again, men a little bit more than women. 2, 15.9%. Here, men a little more than women. But when we get to 3, look at this. There's a little switch. Here, women a little more than men, 9.5% total. But 4 or more, 15.2% for women, 9.2% for men. And the average for the population is 12.5%. Now, what was the average for seminary students that have 4 or more ACEs? It was 24%. Now, what I want to tell you, even though that was about twice the national average, I've been thinking about this. Why do you think that's so? Why do you think that's so? And here's just a hypothesis. Those of us who are attracted to the helping professions, pastors, social workers, psychologists, nurses, physicians, etc. Why are we drawn to those professions? And I would suggest that one reason is to work out some of our own issues. And so I just want to leave us with that, and we'll have some more conversation about that shortly.
Dr. Sedlacek, this is, again, very pointed information. Trauma is everywhere. It is not just in some communities, it is literally everywhere. And based on the information that you shared, Ingrid, and what you just mentioned, we're talking about seminary students. And when we look at the numbers and the disparities, it is literally troublesome to realize that quite often individuals may not necessarily go through the big T's. They may not necessarily go through war or, let's say, a big disaster, but there's subtle instances when young people experience trauma. And so here comes a question that perhaps one of you can help us understand a little bit more. Well, when it is so pervasive, we're talking about in families where literally children who are growing up have very little control over what happens in their lives. What can one do when one becomes an adult facing the fact that trauma has been literally at your doorstep and in your life most of the time? You've talked about a few things, but the reality is that we're facing this on a daily basis. The daily reality of the fact that we, for the most part, have been exposed to traumatic events, and we're not sure what to do, how to go about making a change in our lives. What can we do?
I'll start, and then I'm going to defer over to Dr. Sedlacek, because I know he's done a lot of work, and he can talk about the healing that comes from God and the beautiful spiritual, deep healing. But like we mentioned earlier, Dr. Fisher, counseling. So if you are able to access counseling, please access counseling. Let's take away the shame and the stigma and all of that. Access counseling. Now, for most people, even if you are in counseling, we say counseling for everyone, right? Once a week may be the most you can get in. So what do you do on a daily basis? So are you able to do some of the things we talked about, right? The keeping ourselves healthy, the pausing and the breathing. And I guess I would say to the practical of just saying, okay, today during my day, did I get into my parasympathetic nervous system at all? What can I do? Can I get into nature today? Can I get into something like that? But I also think we got to talk about it. We need to talk about it like we're doing right now. We need to talk about it in our families, in our churches, in our communities, because together we can heal. Healing happens in community.
I'd like to add to what Ingrid said. When we have had pain in our lives, our natural defense, one of the natural defenses, is to not talk about it, to stuff it, to put it away. And I would suggest that we need to be courageous and do the opposite. And that is to share our stories in safe places. I have my students write out their stories, including the hurts and the wounds that they've experienced in their own life. But then the purpose of that The purpose of that sharing is that they can see the truth of their story, and in hearing and then sharing your story with another safe person, you find that you're not going to be shamed or condemned, but that you're going to be embraced. And it's like, oh, I can identify with some of what you shared too. That begins a healing process. And the other one that well, there are a lot of other things, but one of the other ones I'd like to mention is this, that the Bible says in Isaiah 63:9, in all your suffering, God also suffered. Jesus also suffered. In other words, he wasn't just somewhere attending the stars or off, in the universe somewhere. He was present right with you, suffering with you, and therefore you were not alone. In other words, God gets you because he was right there suffering too. On top of that, Jesus suffered abuse of all types. He was rejected, he was abused, abandoned, betrayed. Experienced all of those things so that he can identify with us and we can identify with him. In other words, even though suffering comes into this world as a result of sin, Jesus' redemption comes in his presence right with us during the process of suffering. And he's the God of all comfort who comforts us in all of our suffering and all of our tribulations.
I can also add to that, in terms of what can individuals do to deal with trauma. Of course, as Ingrid mentioned, just talking about it, seeking professional help, or talking with your safe persons, leading on your spiritual life. Spirituality is indeed a protective factor. I find too that when individuals become aware that even though the event has happened, the way that we encode the messages associated with the traumatic event, it keeps replaying in present day. And so even when we are not facing real threat, just our perception of threat creates that fight or flight response. And so it helps in our talking and sharing that we are guided through the process of storing and then restoring. So whatever unhealthy core beliefs we might have internalized during the moments when we experience trauma, it helps to go back and challenge those core beliefs as part of healing and moving through, so that our current perceptions are more guided by the present reality and not informed by what we internalize when we first experience the trauma. It also helps to become aware of how our senses become skewed. So if someone was raised in an environment that, we had an abusive parent or an abusive spouse, our ears become very attuned to maybe the sound of footsteps, or our eyes become very attuned to maybe the look of threat. And so even when those threatening individuals are no longer in our space or in our environment, our senses are still on alert. And so it helps to be able to recognize that and then be able to calm our senses by recognizing that, oh, this is just a perception of threat, but I'm not actually threatened in this current environment.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Knight. So this is really very good information, because early on we heard about the bear that's there, and the bear could actually be a real thing in your life. And it's not just out there in the woods, but it could be in your home, it could be in your church, it could be in your community. And you have to deal with that bear on a regular basis. And the trauma is consistently there in your life. However, there's a possibility that there are messages that are just going on in your brain telling you that there's a bear, when in reality the bear is no longer there. And these messages are so strong in your mind because when you were much younger, you experienced those traumatic events and they left indelible marks in your brain. So the question is, how do you get rid of those messages? How can you move beyond those and remind yourself and somehow get to the place where you acknowledge that, yes, there may have been trauma in the past in my life. And yes, there may have been circumstances that were adverse in my life. But at this point in time, I have the capacity to move beyond. I can do something about it. And we heard a few minutes ago that talking about it is instrumental. Taking it out of the system where it's no longer a secret, when it's no longer just locked in there, helps you to be able to come out and literally begin to breathe and literally begin to experience healing. I know Ingrid wanted to add something at this time. Go ahead, Ingrid.
So again, I go back to the barking dog and the wise owl. It's just a great illustration. And again, I said we use it for kids, but we all need it. Your body's going to feel it first. So it's going to come up in your body during the day. You're going to sense, where is my body at? And even right now, where's your body at? Do you have some tension? Do you have some nervousness? Where's your anxiety? Where's the triggers that we just talked about a minute ago? And so pausing and becoming aware so that then you can say, okay, the barking dog, right, is going off saying danger, danger, danger. Am I in danger? Right? Bringing that prefrontal cortex, bring that wise owl back. Am I in danger right now? And making sure that then sometimes with kids, again, I talk about thinking brain, feeling brain. Are the thinking and the feeling brain talking to each other? So that's integration, right? So having them talk to each other. So on a daily basis. So for me, I use this example with my students pretty often. I have had a couple of pretty bad car accidents with snow. And I live in Michigan. So literally the day I could be in a classroom teaching, and if out the window I start to see flakes of snow, or I heard on the news that morning that it was going to snow, I can feel that in my body already. But if I'm in the classroom, I need to be able to get that barking dog calm so I can keep teaching, doing what I need to do, right? So it snows, I end class, I go to my car, turn my car on, and many times before I head anywhere, I have to do either some vagus nerve exercises, because literally my legs are shaking, so that I can drive myself home. So thinking back through the body, right? The body's going to let you know, and what are some things that we can do? So becoming aware of the body.
Very good. Becoming aware. And in addition to that, we also get from all of these comments that it is being intentional. It is true that, yes, when we're experiencing this, we may know it intellectually. We may know in our brain, okay, I can do this. I'm supposed to. I can heal from this. But it's not enough to think about it. It involves embracing it. It involves being intentional and coming to a place where you believe that you can heal, that these events in your life do not have power over you for the rest of your life. Dr. Nicely, you wanted to add something, and then David.
Yes, as part of the healing journey, healing from trauma, individuals also need to keep in mind or become aware of their right to establish appropriate boundaries in their own lives. And even in the therapist's office, as maybe go talk to someone to work through trauma, the therapist would want to at least make sure that the individual has the ability to experience a sense of safety and stabilization. And clients will need to know to advocate for that for themselves. So as we're advocating, talking about it, it's also important that individuals are aware that talking about trauma outside of a relaxed muscle body or outside of an environment or a space where they feel safe or they feel stable, it can cause re-trauma. We can re-traumatize the individual. And so just setting boundaries in your own lives, and understanding ways to keep oneself safe, ways to keep oneself stable, and mindfulness strategies are also a very helpful technique. So using the senses to tune into the environment, 5 things you can see, 4 things that you can hear, and so on, or walking in nature, or taking off your shoes and being barefooted, just learning to feel stable helps the individual feel in control and then be able to revisit trauma. So that's very important.
Okay, thank you. Establishing boundaries. Again, this is another intentional move on your part so that you can achieve healing. Dr. Sedlacek, you wanted to add something.
Yes, I think it's important that we learn to treat ourselves with grace,
Mhm.
to understand that often we have this inner critic that if we've been given negative messages about ourselves, we end up internalizing that and beating ourselves up. And I think what's really important is to understand that our brains have been programmed, in terms of habits of thinking certain ways and of feeling certain ways that are trauma-based. Grace toward ourselves looks like, it's going to take time to build a new pathway, to replace that old pathway or weaken that old pathway. But that takes time. It's not like turning on a light switch. And giving ourselves time, giving ourselves grace to heal, I think is an important strategy for us to be aware of.
Yeah, that's a very good point here as well, Dr. Sedlacek, giving ourselves grace. You see, what typically happens is that when we as humans experience trauma, it really reduces us to feeling as though we are helpless, that we don't have the power to do anything, that we have very little value or no value at all, and that we have no worth. And so when we are in that state, it's very difficult to believe that we can achieve anything, let alone recover and get to a place where we can achieve healing. So we have to somehow push ourselves away from that, develop a new pathway in our brains that tells us that the message that we had earlier is no longer good. It no longer applies. We have to cancel those messages and come to a place where we are able and willing to redirect our thoughts to healthier messages that will nurture our mind, that tell us, yes, you have value. Yes, you have worth. Yes, you can achieve healing. Yes, no matter what happened in the past, you can still do it because you are a child of God and you have worth no matter what. And so becoming a lot more acclimated to that, as you said, David, it requires for people to be patient with themselves. And quite often, it's a lot easier for us to forgive others than to forgive ourselves. We tend to be able to do that for other people. And especially for those of us who've experienced extreme trauma, it's hard to even feel that we have the value to forgive ourselves and to have compassion towards self. And so in cases like this, we encourage you to seek professional help. As Ingrid mentioned earlier, seek help. If you're here on campus at Andrews University and you've experienced trauma, seek the help of a counselor, seek the help of a chaplain. If you're listening to this and you're at any other school, there's a counseling center nearby. If you're in the community, there are counselors nearby. And towards the end of this program, we're going to put a couple of numbers for you so that in case you're needing help, you can reach out because there is help out there. You can achieve healing. Something that was mentioned a few minutes ago, and I'd like our panelists to touch base on that, is that quite often people who've experienced trauma are attracted to the helping field and they want to help other people. But it's important for us to get a sense as to how can we stop that cycle? How can we stop the cycle of experiencing trauma and perpetuating trauma because we're so traumatized? What are some things that can happen so that we can stop it, and that hopefully, by the grace of God, we can not just achieve healing, but move on to literally becoming or providing a legacy of healthy living so that this intergenerational curse of trauma will not continue through us and through others? What are some thoughts that you may have on that?
I can start. Quite often we call it wounded healers, where we've been wounded and we're drawn to the profession of helping others. So that's us professionally. We must do our own journey. We must do it. We need to be intentional. We mentioned that. And not shy away from, can our woundedness be helpful to someone else? But we've got to be doing our journey of healing with professional supports, with an accountability person. You know, make sure you've got that one. Remember the scientific experiment with the 2 monkeys. Do you have that buddy that you're being intentional and they can hold you accountable to that journey of together healing? Because it's all of us. We're all wounded. So yes, we're talking about us in the profession. But one of the greatest things that we're seeing now is we're encouraging parents, all parents, to be on their own journey of healing, because one of the greatest gifts you can give your kids is that you're on that journey so that it doesn't continue, and you can model that for them. So we need to be talking about it.
Yes. Thank you, Ingrid.
I'd like to encourage us too, because throughout biblical history, God has used wounded and broken people throughout history. And even if you take a look at the origins of the Adventist movement, Ellen White was traumatized. I mean, she had, when she was a young girl, a girl got angry with her and threw a stone at her and hit her in the head, broke her nose, and she was almost died. And she talks about in her history periods of serious depression that she had. James White was a workaholic to the point where it killed him. I mean, our founders were broken people who God used in mighty ways. And the Bible says that when we've experienced God's comfort, we can comfort others with the comfort that we've received from Him. And so it's all of us. And it's a matter of, as Ingrid said, starting with ourselves, our own story, our own healing, then we can be instruments of healing in the lives of others.
Thank you, David. Stacy?
Yes, I can also add to that real quickly. And it is that helping professionals can hold themselves accountable to not perpetuating trauma by taking a look or being mindful or intentional about how they handle their own pain. So there is this little idea that pain times resistance equals suffering. So if as helpers we resist our own pain and try to block it by engaging other strategies or projecting it onto others, it only leads to more suffering, our own suffering and the suffering of other people. But pain times mindful self-compassion equals healing. And so that's one formula that we can all use to hold ourselves accountable, is to do a check on how are we handling our own pain.
Thank you. About 12 million adults in the US experience PTSD on a yearly basis. And we're told that about 8% of these individuals are developing those issues throughout their lives. And about 8 of every 100 women develop PTSD sometime in their lives, compared with about 4 of every man. This is perhaps our last question for this evening. Why is it that women seem to develop these symptoms of PTSD a bit more so than men? Any questions and any answers to that, or What is it about us that get us to experience more as opposed to less PTSD symptoms?
I wonder if it is that we actually do experience it more, or is it that women are more inclined to seek help? And so it becomes more evident that we are experiencing pain, but men are probably more reserved in going to seek therapeutic help. So I wonder if it is that it is our help seeking behavior that makes it seem that we are experiencing it more.
Okay, that's a very good point, because in our society, women are somewhat taught from a very early age to express themselves and their emotions a whole lot more than men. So it is very possible that these expressions of pain and distress are a whole lot more for females than they are for males. The reality is that all of us at one point or another experience adverse types of circumstances in our lives, and some of those may be small t's or big t's. However, regardless of what those might be, they're difficult moments in our lives. The good thing that we got from this afternoon's or today's discussion is the fact that there is hope. There are some things that are within our control that we can do, including, and let me repeat some of those things for you, making sure that we take care of ourselves, sleep, nutrition, getting out into the sunshine, exercising, water, reaching out to get professional support, and literally finding ways to recalibrate, reconfigure the neural passages in our brain to remind us that we have worth and we can achieve healing. We're coming to the end of our program, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to make a comment or two, maybe for about a minute or so, as we wind up to the end of our program. Let's see, we'll start with Dr. Nicely, then we'll go on to Dr. Sedlacek, and our last will be our presenter, Professor Slayes.
I could wrap up by saying that many of us experience traumatic events to no fault of our own. But at some point our healing becomes our responsibility. And so it's important to recognize how we are moving through life and be able to assess if we are engaging healthy coping strategies. And if we are not, then we seek professional help, all the while applying that mindful self-compassion, just being gentle with ourselves as we go through our own healing journey so that we can be more available intrapersonally and interpersonally.
I would like to take us to the invitation that Jesus gives us in Matthew chapter 11, starting in verse 28, where he says, come unto me, all you who are labor and just heavy laden, and I will give you rest. This time of rest that we need every week is therapeutic. And when Jesus says, come unto me, he's inviting us into an intimate relationship with himself, with a God whose love is pure, who loves us more than we could ever know, and gave us evidence of that, of course, on the cross. That is protective. And when we have that weekly rest, real deep rest, it takes away a lot of our anxieties and our fears, or at least it minimizes them.
I'll just leave us with Dr. Bloom's, let's not look at each other. Let's not look at ourselves and say, what's wrong with you? And remember, it's what's happened to us, but by God's grace, and then moving into, and what's strong with us. So then we recall that in him, we are new creatures. Have faith, endurance, strength. You've got this, and we got to do it together, right? We have to do it together.
Thank you, Ingrid. I like those last words. We have to do it together. God's got this, and we can certainly achieve healing. We thank all our panelists for sharing this wonderful information with each one of us. I'm hoping that the thoughts shared during our program today will resonate in the hearts of those who are viewing or will view our program, and that it will result in transforming lives. Thank you very much. We also thank our viewers who literally embarked on this journey with us today, and we thank you for taking the time to be with us. We hope that the information that was shared with you today will be used in amazing ways to help to transform your lives, as well as the lives of all those with whom you come in contact with, and that you will always remember that regardless of what has happened in your life, you were created in the image of an amazing God, a God who created the universe and who continues to maintain us where we are. And this great God has the capacity to literally change our lives and to provide healing. We have to partner with him. It is an intentional move. It is one where we gradually begin to believe that we are his, and he will walk with us on this journey to healing. Thank you again for your time. And there should be some numbers that are being put up on the screen at this time. These are numbers, and let me remind you what those are. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, in case you're experiencing domestic violence, at 1-800-799-SAFE. And the next number is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's 1-800-273-8255. 1-800-273-8255. And another number that you may want to keep in mind is the National Disaster Distress Helpline. This is 1-800-985-5990. 1-800-985-5990. Thank you. God bless you. We pray that you experience healing and have a good day.